Where do I even start with this? To say the Warhammer franchise is a blip far off my radar is pretty accurate, and the cultural impact of it and its spin-off Warhammer 40k has permeated gamer memes for decades. I've heard "wah," misspelled rockets, blood for the blood god, and red ones go faster far before I knew where they all came from, but nothing really pulled me into the series, despite the numerous attempts to make them into video games, some of which got featured on SideQuest, that were subsequently shut down before they ever got out of alpha. But since there's a very new and polarizing Warhammer 40k game on the market that just went free to play, I guess I'm saddled with this again. This is the MMO Grinder, and it's time to look at Eternal Crusade. Warhammer 40k Eternal Crusade, or as I'm probably going to call it from this point on, Eternal Crusade, or just EC, is a large-scale arena shooter featuring a few factions from the 40k universe, specifically the Space Marines, the Chaos Space Marines, the Eldar, and the Orcs, locked in an Eternal Crusade against each other that just boils down to a few assault and defense maps. Also, the Tyranids appear as a non-playable faction relegated to tutorial target practice and a PvE mode. If I sound even remotely invested or knowledgeable about any of these things, it's the direct result of my co-writer Dresker being heavily into the Warhammer universe, as he'll likely pepper lore and observations based on his own personal attachments to the series, while I mindlessly read them as if I give a shit and get the brunt of the flack from those who disagree with his comparisons. However, as far as the gameplay is concerned, I play games, so what comes next is mostly an observation of the game as a game. One major point of issue before we kick this off, Eternal Crusade had a level of advertised features that weren't exactly delivered upon, illustrated by this handy chart of empty promises. There's no persistent open world, no warlords exist, no veteran, hero, or elite units, far fewer weapons, and there's plenty of more examples of, well, not really, and kinda if you think about it this way. But let's say this former buy-to-play game wasn't exactly living up to the promises, and it even promised most of these features at launch. And shortly before that launch date, this image mysteriously vanished from the official site. So now, we have a free-to-play version that's really unwilling to let go of its buy-to-play roots. Shall we begin? We'll start with a high note, as Eternal Crusade absolutely nailed the grimdark aesthetic of the 41st millennium. Seriously, the overall appearance of the game's worlds, characters, models, and weaponry are pretty spot on. It essentially looks like any other officially licensed media set within the Warhammer 40k universe, complete with gothic architecture, skull motifs everywhere, and overly complicated yet archaic-looking technology. The real shame comes when you start to look closely at the developer's work, and things just aren't all that high quality. It could be argued that the game's assets and texture work need to be lower quality to allow it to run well with such large engagements, but given the fact battles have less players than the Battlefield series, it just rings as a hollow excuse. Not helping matters is the fact that animation quality is simply all over the place, with Space Marines and their traitorous Chaos Brethren having that nice weighty feel and impact from wearing heavy power armors, to the goofy running animations of the Orcs and the rather comical run cycle of the Eldar. A game where the entire focus is on large-scale conflict lives or dies off of its presentation, both in aesthetic and graphics, as well as its music and sound design. For the former, it does an okay job, dipping down in impact with both the graphical quality and the animations being somewhat weaker. So how does it stand up in the latter part? Let's find out. I feel like this becomes a common thread on this show, but it's another instance of not realizing how good the music is because everything else in the game drowns it out. What this music is very atmospheric. Each track composed for each faction comes across very fitting. The Space Marines track has an air of righteous purpose, the Eldar track has a very sci-fi, out-of-this-world kind of essence, and the Orc theme is brutal and tribalistic with heavy drum beats. All themes are quite well composed and atmospheric, which of course serve better when listened to outside of the game. Sound design is a bit underwhelming though, given the weapons being used. You'd expect a lot more weight and bombast to the sounds of gunshots. Seriously, a bolter isn't just a machine gun, it's firing rocket-propelled grenades with every pull of the trigger, yet it just feels and sounds like a machine gun in the game. It isn't bad by any means, that's more save for the Eldar weapons, but it just sounds a bit weaker than it should. And yes, speaking of those Eldar weapons, if we want to talk about underwhelming sounds, we cannot forget to mention that the Eldar firepower just sounds like someone spraying a garden hose on the lawn. It's hard to get a feeling of impact from that. Though, thankfully, the orcs have pretty nice and beefy-sounding weapons to go with their set. Now, it isn't to say that the game doesn't do some clever things, even if it was taken from previous Warhammer 40k games. Like the clicking sound that you'll hear when you're running low on ammo with a bolter. The real shame of it, though, is that the battles don't sound like a major conflict, and you don't really get that sense of distant firefights or explosions, and it just makes the world and conflicts feel far smaller than they actually should feel. Thankfully, the voice work, while average, does get across the emotions needed for each situation, even having the charming bits of British street youth speak of the orcs, who are preparing to give a right smash into the Yumis, even the goofy-looking ones. So with our first two categories having a range of okay to poor within it, what does the game itself hold? I suppose the game you could most readily compare Eternal Crusade to would be PlanetSide 2, though much of the depth of that game is nowhere to be found here. You don't take the fight to an entire continent, or even entire cities. Instead, you're limited to rather restrictive maps that don't have any connection to the wider conflict, even if there were promises of a persistent open world. Once the map is complete, you're whisked back to the main menu to either sit through another queue for another match, or to choose another location to fight in, assuming you actually paid for the game, because as a free player, you don't get that choice at all. Instead, you're limited to the Battle Now option, and the game will just choose a random conflict for you, so you can't even help push a single front even if you wanted to. Speaking of fronts, the game is completely separated, so that you can never have a 3 or even 4 front conflict, instead being limited to a 1v1 faction fight, adding further to the feeling of being a single map instead of an open, ongoing planetary war. In keeping with this far smaller scale, the vehicle choices are incredibly limited, only allowing you 2 real options, with a third being only available on siege maps. These are a transport vehicle and a tank respectively, with a siege variety of that tank available on the previously mentioned siege maps. This means you won't find any aircraft providing close air support, no nimble yet small recon vehicles, or bikes. No massive units either, like Land Raiders, Wraithlords, Gorkanauts, or Morkanauts here. Heck, you won't find Dreadnoughts, Wraithguards, Killicans, or Death Dreads either. Really, the variety here is incredibly lacking, not even mentioning the limited arsenal on display for what is playable. When looking through the gear loadouts, you might easily find yourself asking, wait, is that it? It really truly is. The choices of what you can even do with them are incredibly limited. For example, you can't pack a missile launcher as a Space Marine tactical unit. This makes it feel like you have far less options, though you do indeed have options, but that really comes into effect with a rather unbalanced advancement system. That system ensures that veteran players will always have a heavy advantage over new players, and not just from better understanding the mechanics, but because they are outright more powerful. In essence, the longer you play, the higher in the advancement trees you go, and the better equipment, loadouts, and armor you can wear, making you that much more effective at killing everything. Well, we should say this is what would happen if you paid for the game. If you don't, you get to interact with another terrible feature of the free-to-play conversion, and simply get 2/3 of your experience and credits locked behind a paywall that will be constantly thrown in your face. So when going into the game, it isn't uncommon for new players to get the drop on legendary players, put shots into them, only for that legendary player to turn around and proceed to obliterate the new guy from existence with little care for cover, aiming, or effort. The sheer number of times you feel like you can't do anything against these players will quickly ramp up the frustration, especially since they'll have so much better gear and options than you do. It isn't a surprise that cries lamenting getting killed by yet another legendary player would ring out so often in the Discord channel. This system really should be looked into, if not outright removed, as it just makes the experience and balance an awful one in both regards. There's a general accepted lack of balance in the entire product, where people seem to lament the fact that Space Marines and Chaos Marines feel the weakest compared to Eldar, who seem to be the strongest, while the Orcs just get apparently ludicrous rockets. Lest we forget the game was supposed to have elite units at launch as well, as they still have yet to be implemented as of this review. And given how unbalanced the base game is, how that even hope to balance actual elite units like Mech Boys, Warp Spiders, Thousand Sun Sorcerers, and Space Marine Librarians seems far beyond their ability at this point. This isn't even getting to the fact that only 2 classes can even capture or interrupt captures of strategic points. If you didn't pick an assault or tactical unit, but managed to take out an enemy position, you have no choice but to stand there begging your team to get someone there that can actually capture it. Some people have argued that it makes logical sense, and granted that may be the case, but it's also not that fun. Especially since there's no real variety in game types. with the big difference being, do you have to smash a wall down before you capture the points, or do you just capture the points? To be fair, the siege gameplay does have limited respawns for the defenders, and you can't backcap their points, while any other points that the attacker does take will be locked for the rest of the match. Not to mention, if you're a free player, you can't even use jetpack classes, so no blitzing around the environment like a bat out of hell for you, son. Unless you want to fork over $20, but that might not be worth it for you. Oh boy, this is one hell of a toxic community. They're constantly yelling hate and bile at everyone else in the game. There was not a single match that went by for more than 5 minutes without armchair generals turning into blame-shifting abusive psychopaths. Notably, in my very first PvE dungeon and first experience in the game, the rando we got saddled with sat back doing absolutely nothing, only sporadically complaining that Dresker was actively fighting while playing a Chaos Sorcerer and not being his personal heal bot, using short bursts of colorful language, slurs, and insults. First impressions great so far, but in Dresker's case, who'd already been playing quite a while, constantly seeing hate from all sides against everyone gets really hard not to just return the favor and completely snap back. It doesn't help that the game is so frustrating to play, mostly from systems we already mentioned in gameplay, but other reasons that'll become apparent in the cash shop. When you're constantly being destroyed by enemies you have no chance of fighting, or get one-shot by a cannon defcon for the 5th time in a match by someone you can't physically see, it becomes all too easy to let the salt flow and feed into the unending echo chamber of negativity that's infesting this game. Given that friendly fire is enabled in the game, there are instances of team killing that do happen, most of which do tend to be accidents, especially when the fighting moves to close quarters, but others are pretty obviously intentional. The friendly fire even extends to the game's PvE, which takes the forms of dungeons fighting the Tyranids. There really isn't all that much to those PvE dungeons, as you're given rather simple objectives to complete each area before entering an airlock to move on to another section. The difficulty will scale up as you get further into the operation, though sometimes you can be thrown a wild card and just have tougher enemies like Tyranid warriors thrown at you in the second zone. There just isn't much excitement to be had here, and given the fact that very few people actually queue for these dungeons, it seems safe to say the community at large agrees, especially when you get so little reward for even bothering to do them. Granted, the game's population as a whole does seem incredibly low, and while the move to free-to-play has obviously bolstered those numbers a bit, given how limiting the conversion is, it doesn't surprise us that not too many more took the plunge. Many people that are here tend to be your typical armchair generals at their best, sometimes even giving hilariously obvious advice like, we need to take point A on a map where you can only take point A. Couple this with a few spammers found in each match, general rage, and you have an additional recipe for turning as many new players away as possible. But it'll be the cash shop that might truly make you groan. The most obvious part of this cash shop section will be the constant reminder to pay money to have the heavy free-to-play restrictions lifted from your account. There's even a constant reminder while you're in your menus of just how much of your advancement points, requisition, and experience is being locked away. Really makes you want to continue and just see how much the game is taking away from you, doesn't it? The second thing that'll stand out as the cash shop is, well, completely pay to win. I know that's a trigger word for a lot of people, but every single weapon that can be found in the cash shop has additional benefits over their earned counterparts. It's truly amazing that it'd be so blatant to put these items in here, especially in a title that originally didn't have a free-to-play option at all. Maybe you want a bolter, but hey, if you pay real money for it, it'll be more accurate and suffer less recoil. Hey, you want that nice las cannon? Well, if you pay real money for it, it has a heat modifier that affects the enemy. That melt-a-gun sure is nice, but if you pay real money for it, you can fire it for longer and it won't heat up as fast. You get the point. People will naturally argue that even if they do give benefits above their earned counterparts, they actually cost higher LP to equip. But you also have to consider the fact that you get advancement levels to lessen the LP of items that you equip, and you barely use all that much LP to begin with when you're setting up a loadout, so it becomes a moot point. Outside of the pay-to-win, we have the good old-fashioned lucky boxes, which are used to get better equipment and modifications for your loadouts. While you can use your earned requisition credits to pay for these, the fact remains that if you're a free player, you won't be earning requisition at a decent rate to begin with. Having to use these to get better gear just doesn't feel very good, and you can't really plan around getting specific pieces to try and make a build, however limited it may be. Then of course we come to the standard cosmetics, which will vary in price depending on the amount of effort the developers put into it, ranging from $1 or 1,000 RTC, up to $10 or 10,000 RTC. We say developer effort because when there's actual flavor text or a bit of shininess to a piece, the price is higher, and most of the armor pieces are just completely void of any sort of text, just the armor piece itself and what its name is. If you've been following my Twitch streams, or the ones that have also been ending up on YouTube, you might have noticed that we didn't exactly bother with a live and grinding session of this game, instead opting to stream ESO for most of the month. To say this is a game I didn't really enjoy playing is an understatement, and having no direct connection to or interest in the Warhammer 40k universe certainly didn't help matters. Despite this aesthetic accuracy and constant references, none of it pulled me in, and the game as a game offered no appeal to me. Warhammer fans are split, as some matches have had people gladly role-playing their victory with an in-universe taunt, or forgiving the game's various transgressions, while others just feel it's a shell of what could have been amazing and feel it's all the worse off for it. I'm assuming most who have played this have had their mind made up, but I'm still far from being made a fan. Here's my final rating. If there's one thing this game gets correct, it's the aesthetic of its universe. You want bulky armor, insane weapons, and skulls all over the place, you've come to the right game, and Warhammer 40k fans should at least feel at home. The game's scale of battles does a lot more than the current trend of arena shooters, even if it's not exactly what people were initially expecting. It is kind of fun to grab an assault vehicle and head into battle as enemy fire rains down around your transport, only to blow open a hole in the gate and rush inside. There's elements that are interesting, even if a more open world would have helped make that feel more epic. Despite the shoehorning of starting classes, there's a level of customization to your character that lets you at least adjust the way you play them, with both passive perk tweaks unlocking stronger weaponry or alternate secondary weapons to play a character the way you would like to play them, even if that does come with its own issues. The nitty-gritty of the whole cash op comes down to one solid issue. If you buy a weapon, it is better than the one you would earn. Even if the difference may be hard to notice initially, or even seem negligible, the air of pay-to-win permeates throughout the game, even if it's a constantly defended point. Of course, this is a game that just really didn't want to go free-to-play, as you can tell by some of the most restricted features since the original conversion of SWTOR. To have entire class options locked away, and a whole pool of, hey, look at this stuff we're keeping from you, do you want it, huh, do ya? Pay us. It just seems to reinforce it. Is the game worth paying for you? Go ahead and just lift those restrictions right away. But if you're just playing for simple matches and don't want to drop the cash, prepare to feel a pinch. Despite what I or anyone else feels about this game at its current state, it's not what was promised to a lot of people at launch. This is a scaled-down version at best, and if you went in looking for an open world of constant warfare a la PlanetSide 2, you might be turned off of this game immediately. If you do manage to stick around and let the game play out on its own merit, the community might be the ones to drive you away. Sure, there's decent people looking to have fun, but expect far more matches of rage and barked orders to take the general issues of team killing and balance issues far into the next level of intolerance. Balance issues are everywhere, in both how classes are balanced, as well as forcing so many new players into matches against people that they have no statistical chance of defeating, with objectively better armors and weaponry that no amount of skill will be able to counter against without hours of grinding. Of course, those hours will be far more numerous if you're not dropping the cash, and if you just want to soar around on a jetpack, no amount of that grinding will end up letting you do so without a monetary investment. Free players aren't all leeches, as they provide a valuable service to games that focus mostly on multiplayer matches, and maybe the matches wouldn't feel so unbalanced and sparse if you'd let more of them in on the fun. Next time, we'll be back with a different kind of arena shooter that's finally launched. Just hoping it didn't turn sour in our absence.